Representative Petrie lives with his wife Denise, and they have 3 children together, and one of the children, Nick, is here as well. So Nick, thank you for joining us. And then Brian Domitrovic is the Richard S. Strong Scholar at the Laffer Center. He's the author of several books, including Taxes Have Consequences, an Income Tax History of the United States. I had a chance to do a podcast with him, as you heard me share earlier. And it's actually, it's a very readable book, considering its tax policy. Think of dry stuff, but it really is engaging. And I made my way through it and had a great conversation regarding that. Brian is a former associate professor and chairman of the Department of History at Sam Houston State University, where he wrote numerous scholarly and popular publications. Please give them a round of applause. So I'm going to start with Representative Petrie. Jason, you and your colleagues in the State House, Republicans primarily, you, for the first time in 100 years, had a majority in the House, and that meant that you were in the driver's seat when it came to crafting tax policy and other policies that addressed economic flourishing and economic advancement. So here are just a few. You passed in 2017 right-to-work legislation, pension reform, unemployment trust fund, and tax reform. And those were just a few. Those are the high points. There are several other things you've done. But the financial outlook for the Commonwealth 7-8 years ago was not as good as what it is today. In fact, our bond rating was downgraded because we had this unfunded pension liability that was in the tens of billions of dollars. Depending on who you asked and what day of the week it was, that fluctuated. We had a tax policy that discouraged investment and discouraged businesses from coming here, but you have made some significant changes in a short period of time. Probably the most recent change that's made a lot of news the last couple of years is to eliminate the state income tax. Can you speak to, well, first of all, let's start with this. Are Kentucky families better off now than they were 7 years ago?
Yes.
So
Next
question. So the next question is this. You and I know that, by the way. We know that. That was a softball. They're going to get harder from here on out.
Okay. All right, Brian, ready?
But do they know that? You know that on the books, we know that it looks better for families, working families that are paying taxes, but are they feeling it? Do they have more disposable income, for example, that they are realizing?
Yeah. There is a difference between what you feel and what you think. Everybody knows that from here to here, there's a great gulf. Inflation, horrible. Prices up, prices are not going back down. We're not experiencing deflation yet. Inflation is still there, which means we still have a steady but smaller rise in cost. I'm sorry, you want to?
Do we need a? Why don't you?
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear him? Okay, I want to make sure you're hearing in the back.
Okay. Can you hear me? All good? Did you miss all of that, or are we good? Good, wonderful. So with inflation that ever increasing right now, people still feel that, and that's analytic as well as feel. But at the same time, just put this into perspective. You mentioned individual income tax reform. So in 18, we flattened, and we've got several members of the General Assembly, so it's never a you, it's a you in the plural, it's us. There was a decided approach toward taxes of flattening the income tax. Rather than having a small progressive set, it would be a flat tax. At 6, flattened at 6, we automatically reduced it to 5. That's a pretty big cut when you're talking about 46% of your revenue coming to the state on a then about $11, $12 billion budget. 46% is coming in. We cut that from 6 to 5. You've got some COVID errors that come in, then you end up in 22 with the formula to reduce that over time, given conditions to make sure we're not doing it too fast or too deep. And we've gone from 5 down to 4.5, 4.5 to 4, which is in effect now. And then conditions were met this last fiscal year. We will be considering this in the 25 session to go to 3.5% effective January 1, 26. Now, why would I say that relative to inflation? Under current numbers, a point reduction means that we have left approximately $1.4 billion in people's pockets on the individual income tax by that reduction. So having taken that down 2 points, There's at least $2.8 billion left in the pockets of people across Kentucky, individual income taxpayers, by reducing that rate. And then we'll have another $670 million or so, hopefully it'll take effect in January of 26. So there's more money in your pockets, and we know that analytically, and we know that, we feel it because we're having to do with the revenues and make sure everything balances out. Inflation is outstripping that, but we can't control inflation. That is going to be a brine at the federal level. That policy supersedes anything we can do at the local level relative to inflation. So they are better off, but I think it's getting eaten up. One more thing in there.
Yeah.
Wages are rising in Kentucky and have been. They're at the highest they have been in a long time, given the policies that you mentioned and growth policies that would put in effect. So there's actually, the average has gone up. More money's left in people's pockets, but inflation is going to make you feel, when you get the gas and the groceries, it's going to make you feel, things are tight. Until that's dealt with, that feeling's going to still be there.
Did I hear you correctly to say that for every 1 point reduction in the state income tax, it puts $1 billion back into circulation?
$1.4 billion under current dollar valuations.
$1.4 billion.
Actually, 1.3678.
This is why we have Jason up here, because he gets down to the 100th decimal. Okay. So this is a positive policy that's putting more money in circulation for the workers and for families. What have we seen for the business community? Have we seen more businesses come?
Okay. So one thing you may hit on something like this, and hopefully this goes true with what you've been talking about today. Don't forget that 1.4 billion left in people's pockets, that's individual income tax rate. That's money that goes to people, okay? That creates agency. That creates agency for the individuals, for the families to make better choices and have more means and ability to do so. And as far as growth and what's happening on the corporate side, in 18, we did flatten that tax. It was relatively flat already, but made sure it was, flattened it, and pulled it down to 5 also, at which it stayed ever since then. That was about a $90 million. It was $990 million cost at that point on a 1 point down for individual. It's a $90 million cut in 18. That was a small piece of corporate growth for us. What the main thing was is the right to work that you mentioned in 17. If you look at the numbers from 2000 through 2016, we had economic growth. These are non-inflation adjusted numbers. Average about $2.2 billion a year. Fairly tight range, $2.2 billion during that time period. Right to work passes in 17. At the end of 17, and we're at 3.5 to almost 4 times that amount. The next year it increases slightly. And then that takes care of 17, 18, 19 was good, fairly consistent. 20, we bottomed back down to 2.2 billion. COVID. Pin up, we go way up in 21, 22, 23, we're back down to about 4 billion. But we have projects that are continuing to go, and we see that relative to our peers, we're still performing at a much higher level. It is a huge difference when you're talking about $2.2 billion average and go to 3.5 times that and maintain it. And even if you were to take 17 through 24, 23 fiscal, we're still right in that $7 billion range per year on average.
Very good. I'm going to move to federal tax policy. So Brian, we have, if you haven't heard, a presidential race. Right? We're going to go to the polls in just a couple weeks, 2.5 weeks, and vote for the next president of the United States. One of the candidates, Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris, proposes, she's got a very comprehensive tax proposal, but I want to hit some of the high points, and I'd like you to address these. One of the most talked about is a $25,000 tax credit for first-time home buyers over 4 years. She also proposes to increase the corporate income tax rate from 21% to 28%, and then also to increase individual income tax rates up to just under 40%, 39.6%, on incomes above $400,000 for single filers and $450,000 for joint filers. And let's start with the $25,000 tax credit for first-time home buyers over 4 years. Good idea or bad idea?
Yeah, Kamala Harris's ideas that don't make any sense on any level about the $25,000 credit for, I guess it's a tax credit, I'm not sure what the structure of it is, for home buyers. So home affordability is a big issue in the United States, I guess, ever since COVID. What's our interpretation? What's my interpretation of home prices? It's funny, the Case-Shiller Index, which is the national index, the vaunted national index for home prices, started in 1984 by an economist at Wellesley College named Chip Case. And he had noticed in the last 5 years, Massachusetts property prices had started going way up, and he didn't know what was going on. He came up with this index that now he ended up selling to S&P for $100 million 10 years later. And he noticed that Massachusetts prices were going way up. He didn't know why, and the reason is that Massachusetts capped property taxes, absolutely hard cap, through a ballot initiative in 1980, 2.5% increases every year, a year that inflation went up by 14%. So much money went into housing, it wasn't even funny. And that's the origin of the very Case-Shiller Index, his property tax cap. Our interpretation of why house prices are going up, the same as it was in the 1970s. The Case-Shiller Index shows that housing prices in the United States really didn't budge outside of the Great Depression in real terms, in median terms, from the 1890s until 1970, with a crash in the Great Depression. Unchanged in real terms over the long term. And then all of a sudden, since 1970, secular increase. With some dips, like the Great Recession, secular increase, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in real terms what houses were selling for the long term. What changed in 1970? Going off the gold standard. When you take the dollar off gold, substitutes for dollars that are rooted in geology in particular will be found. What goes up? Land goes up in price. What goes up? Gold goes up in price. What goes up? Oil goes up in price. So we see the housing crisis as a dollar crisis. I mean, land is one of the absolute A1A hedges against the dollar. If there's questions about the dollar's value, land goes up. So if you think the problem is people don't have enough money to buy houses, no, you have a lousy dollar. If people want the dollar, they get out of hedges. Land doesn't pay anything, doesn't have a dividend, doesn't have a coupon, just like gold, just like oil, just like all the geologically limited things in supply. When people don't want financial assets that pay a coupon because it's going to be taxed at 42% or whatever her rates are, yeah, they want to have the capital, the protection of an asset that doesn't pay a tax. I mean, when your land appreciates, you don't have to sell it and pay a government tax. It's a tax hedge, and it's a dollar hedge. So if we had tax rate cuts, if we took the top rate down from 40 down to 21 or whatever, you would see money flow out of land and into real investments and titles to enterprises, and you'd say bye-bye to the housing crisis. That's the way the American economy always was. In the 19th century, there's never any housing crisis because there was a sound dollar. So her proposal simply shows that she has no idea what's going on in terms of what's driving the housing market.
Brian, I want to follow up with that. If the federal government were to cut the personal income tax rate that drastically, where would they make up the difference to fund necessary parts of government?
Sure. No, Richard, we are talking from the perspective of the Laffer Center. We believe deeply in the Laffer curve. We think, with a lot of empirical evidence, that at 42.5%, which would be Kamala Harris's tax rate, marginal rate, same as was under Bill Clinton, Medicare add-ons included. On a progressive system above $600,000 in income, all of those people are avoiding that rate. I mean, they all are. I mean, they're by definition the people who, number one, really want the money the most. They're the richest. Number two, they know how to deal with their money the best. They're the richest. And number three, they get things done. So the idea that the Laffer curve responses don't happen at 42.5% is just out of the question. I mean, of course you can cut that rate in half and see basically no revenue impacts from that top group. What you will see is much more rational deployment of capital and income from that high level, so that you'll see lower income people earn more money because the rich aren't sheltering their money from taxation. They're deploying in the economy like they want. No, I'm pretty confident you'd see a boom in tax revenues. One thing we always talk about, when Donald Trump cut that corporate tax rate, the increase in aggregate federal revenues over the previous 2 years was greater than the increase from the 2 years prior to that. So when you had Obama's tax system the last 4 years, you had 2 years over 2 years an increase, then Trump cut tax rates, the increase was greater than before. So the Laffer curve works.
Tell us, I'm convinced, I agree with that, that's why you're up here. But what does this do, so if Kamala Harris is elected and implements her tax policy regarding corporate income tax from 21 to 28%, what will this do to American businesses?
I mean, if the United States raises its corporate tax rate, I mean, we know what's going to happen. Corporations will be harried out of the country and into other forms, into other guises, into some less efficient form of organization. than is the case under the 21% rate. I mean, what was the big argument when the rate was 35% just in 2017, 2016? The big argument globally was the United States had all this offshoring of operations and of booking of profits because the tax rate was so high. So in other words, we already know what's going to happen. I mean, everything's going to be offshored, and the more you get used to doing business in Ireland or Iceland or Singapore or whatever, the more you say, what do we need the United States for at all? So if you want to set in a long period of decline, of stasis and decline in the United States, get companies used to not locating in the United States, which is what will raising the corporate tax rate will do.
That's good. So this brings us to a political question, because you have political candidates campaigning as, well, the rich are getting richer, we just need to tax them, make them pay their fair share. That's a slogan that we frequently hear. So my question is to you. You are a leader in Kentucky, you've had to run for office. How do you respond to that argument that the rich just needs to pay their fair share? How do you convey what Brian is saying about lower tax rates, particularly with corporations, will keep businesses here? Freeing up money for people to spend on their own is good for the economy. So what's your response on the campaign trail or talking to a town hall meeting when it comes to this class warfare language that we've heard?
We'll try to keep it in that vein of town hall or campaign and get deep in the analytics side, but really twofold primarily. Hit back on the very last piece of what you said first. If you can pull it back and do it.
So as far as reducing the corporate tax rate keeps businesses here and putting more money into the economy, letting people keep more of their money, it leads to economic flourishing, essentially is what I was saying.
So we deal with that on tax reform, two things. Tax reform side of it, yes, Laffer curve in the sense of if you encourage by lower taxes, growth, investment, which we've gotten, you'll have more. Your revenues could actually net increase. And that's an analytic piece, and some people get it, some people don't. Hopefully this one does. On the campaign trail and in town halls, oh, y'all hate poor people. You love rich people because they line your pockets. That's what you're gonna hear. Okay, so some simple things from at least Kentucky's perspective is this. Let's say we've got about a $15 billion general fund budget per year. And let's say that about 40% of that goes to public education. Let's say that about another 20-something% goes to Medicaid. So you're going to be well over 50, approaching 60% for public education and Medicaid. How many really, really rich people go to public school and engage in Medicaid? Think of one? Can you think of one? Yeah, don't. So we are taking a large part, a tremendous part, and you can name off other programs where we are really supporting to the point of from healthcare, education, and a lot of other social benefits that we put out there. It is an extremely large part of our budget to support people at 30,000 less, 20,000 less, really 40,000 less. And when you talk about we need to tax more people, look, we are pushing tremendous value. When we place value, we're pushing tremendous value to people where they live at. We have revenues. If we want to tax those that are making the money, we will have less money in order to take care of these programs in the long haul. But most people come from the approach of you're trying to let the rich off the hook and tax the little guy. That's an easy thing to say. But look where we're spending all the money. The vast boatload of the money is going to the little guy. And it's coming from the large guys.
And that's well, I'm going to put a place mark on that and come back to that point in just a moment, but I would like to ask Brian, as far as federal tax policy, if you could have one policy that would jumpstart the economy, one policy at the federal level, what would it be? What would you do?
Yeah, Robert Bartley, the great supply side editor of the Wall Street Journal back in the 80s and 90s, he used to say, you know, he was very kind of abrupt, and he would say, here's what you do with tax rates. You find the highest marginal rate and you cut it. So what's the highest marginal rate? Find that when you cut it. I think right now that would be the estate tax, right? I mean, that's essentially a national property tax. I mean, it's 40%. I think it's trending to go up. So that on Barbara Bartley's principle, I think I'd do that. And certainly if the income tax rate goes to 42.5%, I found the highest marginal rate. I'm cutting that. That's what Donald Trump did in 2017. effectively the highest marginal rate in the United States tax code was the corporate rate, because it was higher than any rate among the major countries internationally in 2017. He found the highest rate and he cut it. No wonder that policy worked. So I would say I would totally abide by Robert Bartley's principle. The other thing is, what are we doing with our fiat money system? I mean, we've had a 20% inflation, and we really think going off the gold standard in 1971, which caused a 200% inflation. And you know, Donald Trump was more of a gold standard man. So was Janet Yellen as chairman of the Fed. Gold was absolutely stable at $14.50 an ounce, while she was scared as chairman of the Fed. Oh, I'm scared to do anything, and you know, the markets love that when the Fed is not activist. And as soon as everyone says, "Hey, we know what we're doing, we're Keynesians," you know, gold went to $2,700 an ounce, and which is not coincidental. We had a 20% inflation because nobody wants the dollar. So I'd stabilize the dollar and cut taxes. Cut tax rates.
Now, before you go past that, Richard, I want to say this. You hear I hope you're catching a good part of what he's talking about at the federal level, and I hope we're making some sense at the state level. But these are basic concepts, not real deep in the details, to the point where I almost want to require that every legislator and every executive branch official has to have micro 101 and 102 macro, the way it was taught 30 years ago. Not the way it's taught now, because the air that you breathe with modern economics can't even recognize the language you're talking about, which is ridiculous. Anyway.
No, that's good. So I'm going to go back to that point about the top taxpayers in the Commonwealth paying for programs that are benefiting lower socioeconomic classes. We have a number of problems with the idea of work, the dignity of work,
Yep.
the value of work, the encouragement of work. We're made in the image of God. As we heard in the very first session today, Robert Cunningham talked about we are tasked with this idea to steward the earth, to create things, provide for our families, develop the resources that God has given us. But we've lost that vision. And Kentucky has a crisis in workforce participation. Depending on different organizations that have done surveys, it's right about 45 in the nation in workforce participation. Earlier this summer, the rate was at right about 57% of working age Kentuckians are employed in the workforce. So, Jason, what are some of the things that you've done in the legislature or plan to do or are talking about doing to incentivize more people to engage in the workforce in the Commonwealth?
Okay, well, first off, on the workforce participation, you just say 23 to 54-year-olds. That's what we're basically looking at. That's where your prime working age is going to be at. And generally for 20 or 30 years, Kentucky's lagged generically about 10 points behind the rest of the country of how many people are participating out of that age group. However, I will tell you that I went and did a little digging just this week because of the question popping up. If you were to exclude about 12 counties in East Kentucky, then the rest of the state is real close to on par with the rest of the country. A little behind, but not nearly behind, as pronounced as it is, 10 points, maybe within 2 points or so. But there are about 12 to 15 counties that really just pull us down. Now, there's a couple of things. What have we done? Well, the income tax can actually help because it encourages development, but you don't want development happening in the triangle. That's not in East Kentucky, that's not in West Kentucky, you want to spread it. So we've got product development initiative where the state goes across with $100 million in the first time, about $70 million in this next couple of rounds of trying to develop in small places, medium places, not in the triangle, not in the metro areas, to start up. If you start up businesses so that there are jobs available for people, especially in those East Kentucky counties. Heretofore, legislature, General Assembly, and the executive branch has never tried to spread stuff out. They've always gone, hey, we can cherry pick in the Golden Triangle, things are easy for us, and maybe another city or two. So we try to spread that out. But you take that, you take the income tax, you take the infrastructures that we're building up, we keep trying to spread and spread and spread so we can build support systems across the state. You've got a lot of coal that's lost, a lot of jobs, but I'm going to tell you, you get to a point when you start looking at these numbers, even if it's a localized issue, more pronounced somewhere, you get to a cultural type of understanding about work, and you've got to watch out for it. Work is a very dignified thing. Drug use is not. Work is a very dignified thing. Not taking care of your kid is not. Work is a very dignified thing for mental health, physical health, family health, community health in the state of the Commonwealth. Doing otherwise is not. And it's not just because economics says so. It's because if you look from a biblical basis, we were made to do. We were made to produce. Whether it is Great Commission, or whether it's go and subdue, or whether it's go and replenish the earth, in all the different ways, we are made to do. There is a cultural issue that we deal with in Kentucky after having looked at everything. We have supported. We have got to get out and talk. Okay, first, before I say this, anybody here hate work? Yeah, I want to see somebody raise their hand. No, hate work. If you think, there's just not much value in work, you're probably in the wrong room, number one. Okay. Okay. But if there is, then do you, each one of you in the room, do you ever talk to other people about the value of work? Don't go and say, you lazy hound, get off your butt and do something. That's really not about the value of work. That's an ad hominem personal attack. You're not going to get anywhere. But do you talk and celebrate when people get a job? Celebrate when they jump up. Have a family celebration. Have a church celebration. The value of work is a cultural shift that I think Kentucky's going to have to work on.
That's good. Here in this country, the number is, 16% of prime working age men, that's between the ages of 25 to 54, 16% are not working. And it's not because they're disabled or have something that's holding them back. About a quarter of that number have college degrees. That number is higher than prime working age men who were unemployed during the Great Depression. We've got a crisis that nobody is talking about. My question to you, Brian, is there a federal policy, one policy or something that can be done at the federal level to incentivize work for, we've got these men, and again, they're prime, that are not working. What would you do if you were president or had a place where you could, a position where you could craft a policy to incentivize work?
Yeah, this is another one of these un-American phenomena that I see in the 21st century, like young men not working. We know basically exactly why it happened, because we started all these welfare programs really in the early 2000s to pay people not to work, and they were really exacerbated in the Great Recession and the aftermath. I mean, all these new eligibility tests, these new benefits, Section 8 housing, Obamacare, earned income tax credit, just COVID checks, just one after another, beginning in 2008. If you don't work or minimally employed, you get these benefits. I mean, Trump's economist, Casey Mulligan, calculated that it put about 10% on the average marginal tax rate for somebody moving onto work. I mean, the highest effective marginal tax rates in the code are actually on those people who go from zero income up to $50,000 in income. I mean, they might lose $50,000 worth of benefits in going from zero income to $50,000. So zero. They go to work and they get paid nothing, literally, because they have to, 100% tax rates. So I mean, it's pretty clear that's what caused it, and all that stuff costs money. That's the reason we have this debt. This debt, this new $8 trillion that we just tacked onto the debt, it's all paying people not to work. When Reagan took out debt, it's to win the Cold War. So I mean, we got to stop that stuff. And the long trend, we don't have labor force participation statistics going back into kind of the pre-World War II period, but it's weird. We understand that women did a lot of work in the 20s. They proportionally did a lot of work in the 30s too, comparative to men, because men were thrown out of work at a higher rate. They obviously did a lot of work during the home front in World War II. And they only really stopped doing a lot of employment market work after 1945 because the stacked tax code had income tax rates up to 94%. And if you stacked a married wife on top of her husband's tax return, I mean, you just got murdered. And that's one of the reasons Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, is because all these women were just kind of driven into the four walls of the suburbs. I was like, I like to work. And people talk about it as the golden era of the family. Yeah. But families organically develop when you have low tax rates, really low tax rates, tremendous economic opportunity. And then you see the natural sorting of the workforce into men and women and people staying at home. So all these policies just messed it up. I think the best approximation we have is when Reagan cut tax rates. When Reagan cut tax rates down 28% and then corporate rate down, then you start to see a more natural displacement of workforce and the kind of the sexual distribution of labor. In the peak in labor force participation was 2000. So it's just been another one of these 21st century stories of patheticness. You stopped cutting tax rates, and you started giving away welfare, and then we're here talking about these really kind of silly un-American problems.
Yeah, what I was talking about on the cultural is not distinct from what he's talking about, but from two different perspectives, I think. And the reason being is, okay, so I don't know what the average age in here, but I will say when I grew up, I was born in 71. So as I'm growing up, if somebody had to receive food stamps, or somebody had to receive social assistance, it wasn't anything that was talked about. Because you're not supposed to be doing that, okay? Entitlements, social benefits, social programs over time, you come up into, now COVID era is a little pronounced, but running numbers, you're looking at about in Kentucky during COVID and all the benefits that were being extended, you would have to make a little over $28 an hour for it to economically make sense for you to go to work rather than receive government benefits.
But what if the tax rate was zero? If benefits, if the tax rate's zero, then what's the hourly rate that you have to make to come out the same?
But there's two things, and hopefully, Brian, if you disagree, that'll be good because I can learn more. But there's two things going on there. Yes, you can reduce tax rates, spur growth, but you also can't be putting sugar sweets out through entitlement programs at the same time. Those have to wean back to necessity to let that growth happen with a lower rate.
But if you go from zero to 50,000, if you lose $50,000 in benefits by going to work,
Yeah.
you can still leave the benefits where they are, but where is the point reached where there's an incentive to go to work without losing the majority of the benefits, like Brian just described? There has to be a sweet spot somewhere in there, and I'm not smart enough to figure it
No,
out.
you're good.
That's what you guys.
There are a lot of people that always look at benefits cliffs. It's called the benefit cliff.
Yeah.
The problem is that you're going to get it with different points with different people. If you step back for a moment, the trick is to reduce the benefits in general, reduce the tax burden, which makes a complete transition over, let's get to work, but still meet the needs of people. And a cliff-wise, there have been approaches of, okay, then tear it down with credits, with whatever, tear it down. So once you get to a certain spot, you start weaning off of it. I've not seen a good example of how that could be done, and I've seen at least 3 good models of it in Kentucky. I don't think any of them work well. I think reducing the benefit package, reducing the tax burden is the best way to get the participation and get people off of that.
One other thing, this is my thing. If we allow the language to be captured, we're using the term entitlements.
Mhm.
That's not good lingo
Sure.
to use when we're
Sure.
talking about these kind of things. That's why there weren't entitlements in 1971. I graduated high school in
Sure.
1970, so entitlements is the wrong word to use.
Good.
We need to wean ourselves away from that as Republicans and conservatives. We need to start using that terminology. We've let them capture the language, and that's hurt us a lot.
And you'll see that I go entitlements, social benefits, social programs.
Right.
In this group, I'm like, whatever the phrase needs to be to
Right.
understand what we're talking about. But
Right.
yes, you always have to watch language.
So Jason, here's my follow-up to that. Is there political will in the Kentucky State Legislature to wean those benefits, whatever we're calling them? Is there will to start paring back on the sweet stuff that's out there, as you put it?
Yeah. So we're going to get a lot of federal interaction with, we can pick whatever phrase y'all want to, social programs. Let's just look at it for that, for habit practice. A lot of this comes from the feds, and we're caught, we have to administer certain pieces we can't modify, it has to remain. I think there's been 2 or 3 attempts, Representative Meade is one of the biggest ones that have pushed on this, to deal with SNAP benefits, to deal with the cliff, it's just extraordinarily complicated. And we get caught with, wait, we can't do that because of the Fed requirements. We can't do it because of the regulations at the Fed. We're really limited in what we can do. Is there an appetite? Yes. The lack of how to, like how do you get there? Legally and economically on policy, I don't think there's been a clear push, like here it is, this is what we can do.
Jason, it would seem to me if we're going to make change on social welfare programs, it's got to come from the state level, because certainly Congress does not have the will to do this. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brian.
Sure, I think there is one model in history, recent history, of the federal government getting it done in terms of reforming the social programs. And that was in the 1990s, the welfare reform, 1996. Nobody even noticed it happened. There were, as I mentioned this morning, there were 2 7-year 4% plus GDP growth runs per annum in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. Yeah, when you have 1995 to 2000, more than 4% growth every year, the economy's tossing off so many jobs, you can just like line out your welfare program and no one's even going to notice it. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, we just had tremendous economic growth. There was such demand for the workforce. That's why workforce participation went up to 67%. So yeah, I mean, if you do the opposite of Kamala Harris and take the corporate rate down to 15%, lower the marginal rate of the income tax, lower the tax rates on the rich, on the highest earners, what are they going to do with that money? They're going to deploy it in business investments right now, which are jobs machines. And you won't even notice, say, just scratching out your public assistance programs.
That's good. We've got time for a couple of questions, and floor's open. Right over here.
We were actually discussing this a little earlier, about where to put the businesses at in Kentucky. You know, there's that trifecta in Northern Kentucky, Lexington, and Louisville. Part of the reason I think is because they're easy to get to. I went to school in Berea College. Eastern Kentucky is kind of hard to get to a lot of times. And how do we balance? We need, in my opinion, we need a united plan, like a business plan. Because if you want to put a factory in Jackson County, you're going to have roads. You're going to have to take out houses. You're going to have to build a Kentucky highway. How do we get that plan across the voters? Because we're going to have a united plan if we want to put businesses in these parts of the state.
Yeah, so just think about this, just rattle off a few things real quick. I agree. So East Kentucky Mountain Parkway, okay, we just took in the 24th session under House Bill 1, $150 million of general fund money, put it into road, which has not been done until 2022 in the first budget that the House had filed ever. We put that money in this time and matched the I-69 from Owensboro crossing the river, or Henderson crossing the river. Just got the feds approved for $116 million grant with another 50 and a little bit somewhere else. And 150 we put on the table. Mountain Parkway is paid for. That artery will be completed. We've had I-69 artery we're trying to complete. We've got small thing in budgeting that we do. We stopped draining money. We stopped draining money out of the road fund. It went from $200 per person in 18 to 420 to nearly 822, and we're above that for this cycle. So we actually are able to work on projects now, not just trying to find the pennies to fix the potholes. We put in through House Bill 1, $15 million a year just to deal with river ports to artery into the highway system. Also put in $15 million plus for railroad, short spur, and other things that get you to businesses. This is across the Commonwealth. So artery and veins, we very much believe in. Water, wastewater, electricity. There are hundreds of millions of dollars we did in regular budget, as well as House Bill 1, one-time investment out of the reserve account. Yes, yes, and yes, and we are putting taxpayer money where the mouths are supposed to be talking about it and doing it. It's not something that results in 6 days or 6 months, but it does have the result. If you said, what should limited state government be spending money on, taxpayer money on, if anything else? Infrastructure that individuals can't afford to build themselves. That's your artery vein, and that's the way you start building out along with the PDI program and so forth and so on. You start seeding out that economic growth across the Commonwealth. We have a plan, and we've been executing on it at least since 22, nascent in 19, COVID interrupted, and we're off and going again.
Very good. We've got one more question back here, and then we'll wrap it up.
It's building on his. A certain component of work, a barrier to that seems to be transportation. TARP doesn't seem to know how to deal with their money, and they've got like 30 million in shortfall. Is there any appetite in funding local transit with whatever strings necessary to make sure it gets spent in the right way?
Yeah, that one's come in my office recently. We've talked about it. TARC is basically with federal money, not with state money, never has been. State money supports more of the rural infrastructure for transportation. If we were going to break historical precedent, we would look at state money going into TARC and other federally funded programs. Not the best move for us. Plus, one of the things you want to look at is what you mentioned. How has it been run over time? If you bail out bad decisions, now I'm not saying TARC is or isn't, but look into it. if you bail out bad decision and bad business operations, you get more of it.
Thanks.
Very good. We are out of time. I want to thank all of you again for coming. Jason Petrie, thank you for joining us on this panel. Brian Domitrovic, thank you as well. Let's give him a round of applause. We've got a few minutes until dinner starts, but you can make your way back to the main room, the barn, and we'll see you there in just a little bit.
Hope all that was good enough.
Well, yeah,
Good deal, very good. I'd love to sit down and talk to you.
Sharpest things you say.